I'm sorry. We don't have time for pleasantries or cutesiness or side gags or wordplay or the one that you typically show you baloney with a back. I'm not going to find a time sandwich that tops the ghost of dinosaur meat or me a stick of butter or any of them. Mr. Cody! Get the I don't have time for you. Because we have a serious crisis on our hands, people. Apparently, there is an insidious force that is currently infecting every aspect of American life. It's assaulting our brains, our bodies, our souls, our whatever you hold dear. It's invading our homes, our corporations, even our military, and even more citizens. It's ruining the minds of our children by completely consuming our schools. It's like a virus, but like one they care about. Who are they, you ask? What the am I talking about? Followed up on this. Well, in case you didn't see the title of the episode, it's Critical Race Theory, Critical Race Theory, Critical Race Theory, Critical Race Theory. Ah, yes, Critical Race Theory. The latest boogeyman being written by the GOP, so hell, I guess. The latest cancel culture outrage triggering of conservative snowflakes. The latest thing we have to talk about in order to coddle these oversensitive whiners. We don't want to, but they make us. Republicans are always able to manufacture controversies out of whole cloth and force the entire country to talk about them. Weeks of Dr. Seuss. Every year, the war on Christmas, the threat of Sharia law in America, King Benghazi, Barack Obama's citizenship, the caravans. Oh, the caravans! Of course, there was the gay agenda. Now there's the supposed transgender agenda, which granted, way catchier. We had to talk about whether or not 3 million illegals voted in the 2016 election, an election that they won, unlike the one they just lost, stolen by communist Joe Biden. They recently made people debate whether or not Joseph Robinette Stalin Jr. is planning to ban hamburgers. Do you remember when the United States House of Representatives cafeteria changed their French fries and French toast to freedom fries and freedom toast for years because Fox News and conservatives got mad and France didn't invade Iraq as good as us? Do you remember these things? And now we are forced to talk about whether or not critical race theory is destroying America and should be canceled, cast out of the marketplace of ideas. Very un-American of our GOP representatives, for shame. But whatever, let's do it. Let's hear them out, as apparently we must. What is so bad about critical race theory?
You're hearing a lot about critical race theory, so what is it? This is
teaching kids to hate their country. Teaches that America is totally spoiled. Critical race theory teaches children as young as kindergarten to be ashamed of their skin color.
Nothing more than modern day racism.
Replacing the racism of the past to the racism of the critical race theory.
A historical plan about our next door says the United States is rotten to its core.
Indoctrinating children.
You're either an oppressor or a victim, and gone as a bag of hate.
Whoa. Okay. That all sounds really bad and true. Kids coming home, saying they're being taught to hate themselves and their nation, and question the wisdom of our many dear leaders, being told it's okay to be racist to them, sobbing, pleading to not be white anymore. The teachers shove them, pointing, cackling, white. Plus, a lot of the teachers are white. They've been spitting on them and stuff. Anyway, let's hear from the parents.
Here with more are 3 parents from Loudoun County, Virginia. We have Jessica and Fred and Patty.
We've got this mother who's criticizing the Colorado school board on the impact critical race theory is having on students.
For another example of everyday Americans fighting back for their liberties, Tisha King is a Florida mom who took a bold stance against critical race theory, claiming that the teaching of race is in fact racist. Joining me now with Loudoun County parent Ian Pryor and Kim Klasik, president of Red Renaissance.
Our next guests were both there. Father of three Miss Army vet Joe Mobley and a teacher at Douglas School in Loudoun County, Jeremy Wright, both joined me from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Guys, 4 to 2.
You want the devil with these kids? This white kid right here got exactly what he white. You want to hurt me though? White people? Oh, the white people are all down the place. How do I have to know these I'm here on Wednesday?
Sandra, the Florida State School Board has now voted to ban critical race theory from being taught in public schools in the Sunshine State. It comes as more parents across the country are pushing back against so-called woke curricula being taught in classroom. Bridget Ziegler is a mother of 3 girls and a Sarasota County school board member. She joins us now.
Joined out by Carrie Lucas, a Virginia mom of 5, and her 13-year-old daughter Meredith, currently a Virginia public school 8th grader.
Here we act as Alexander Little League parent and an informal advisor to the 2016 Trump campaign, Barry Bennett. An amazing outpouring of hold up. Can we run that last clip again? Here we act as Alexander Little League parent and an informal advisor to the 2016 Trump campaign, Barry Bennett. Did he say that guy was an informal advisor to the 2016 Trump campaign? That's some weird coincidence. How Barry Bennett, the conservative host at Fox is interviewing there, also happens to be a political operative and lobbyist for the Republican Party. I mean, surely that's just one. And the rest of these parents and teachers are, what's that, Mr. Finger? You love where I've been putting you? Oh, and every single one of them is a political activist or operative or lobbyist. And in fact, of those people I just showed being interviewed, along with the Trump advisor, there were multiple right-wing talk radio hosts, several GOP consultants and professional commentators, the founders of multiple conservative super PACs, a conservative author and the former senior domestic policy analyst for the House Republican Policy Committee, amongst many other things, and multiple conservative activists and think tank members, including one with connections to Turning Point USA. Literally 0 of those people were fresh off the street, non-politically tied individuals expressing their concern about critical race theory and their children. Yes, it turns out that a lot of this grassroots concerned parent movement sure feels like it was put there artificially, like some sort of artificial grass or fake turf, if you will. So while it's important to not hand-wave every single parent or teacher as some kind of operative for the GOP, it does seem as if the most vocal of these conservative Americans, the reasons this is a thing anyone's even talking about, aren't simply everyday people suddenly concerned with their kids' education. Like this Florida mom named Keisha King, who was in that montage I showed. Well, she made a bunch of headlines for being a black woman standing up against the evils of critical race theory. But when you just sort of scroll down, most of these articles end up noting that she's the co-founder of one chapter of a group called Moms for Liberty, an organization that has branches everywhere in the country. And if you Google the words Moms for Liberty and critical race theory, you'll soon discover that pretty much every article about a concerned parent will eventually note that they are a member of this group, a group that, before they were so worried about critical race theory, were out protesting mask mandates in schools back in April, a group that was founded by 2 ex-school board members, one of whom has been accused of physically disrupting classrooms, and the other was voted out after opposing pro-LGBT guidelines, and then getting shit out to her, like literal actual. They're just bitter, ousted, and toxic people trying to re-involve themselves in schools. And yay, they succeeded. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The question is, what is critical race theory? And is it being taught to our children? Very briefly, the basic tenets of critical race theory, or CRT, emerged out of a framework for legal analysis in the late 1970s and early 1980s, created by legal scholars Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, among others. Less briefly, critical race theory argues that racism is not just a matter of personal prejudice or explicit legal discrimination, but can be found in everyday social practices and is embedded in our legal system. It places specific emphasis on history and context in relation to discussion of race in legal discourse, and seeks to understand how white supremacy was created and how it is maintained, and to examine its relationship to professed ideals such as the rule of law and equal protection. It argues that race is not only a social construct, but a legal construct, and that while the biological reality of race is false, there is a very real, material dimension to being raced in the United States of American society, and that this dynamic has been both produced and sustained by law. It finds fault with the ideal of color blindness, which ignores the effects of centuries of documented racism, and instead embraces the notion of race consciousness. It uses concepts such as white privilege and intersectionality to better understand the dynamics of the social, material, and legal inequalities throughout our society. It aims to expose the racial dimensions to the meritocracy mythology. It is a political practice of progressive activist movement and an intellectual identity for scholars of color that takes the form of left intervention into race discourse and race intervention into left discourse. It addresses the law's treatment of race from a self-consciously critical perspective. It believes that reform is required within the legal system itself, law schools and courtrooms. Critical race theory is not only concerned with understanding the ways in which our history of racist laws and social practices have created racial inequality, and how white supremacy is maintained within our society and through our legal system, but critical race theory is an intentional and explicit effort to change this dynamic. So, is this being taught to our elementary, middle school, and high school students? The short answer is no. And if you are skeptical of this claim and are a parent, ask your child to watch this clip and then get back to you. Critical race theory has certainly connections to any kind of critical intellectual discourse, but it's also connected to critical legal studies, which was not committed to sort of inheriting all of the kind of Gramscian and Marxian sort of ideas that you're talking about. And again, the type of Marxism we're talking about is very narrow, thin, sort of cool Marxism, or what we call vulgar Marxism, the legendary relationship between economic base and cultural superstructure that wants to one really fast. What most Marxists argue, and what certainly most Marxists post, the big part of the 20th century argue, is that it's a much more complicated dynamic that even Gramsci himself argues that it's about this idea of hegemony and how it happens from compromise history, whereby some people, or whereby on the one hand, actually are hostage to the economic conditions around us, but on the other hand, structures and states and institutions also appeal to our own desires and our own interests and our own needs. It's a much more dynamic, complicated relationship that we're talking about. And as far as sort of structures, you're making a connection between structures in terms of institutional structures that I was talking about, and a particular type of structure that say social we're talking about in terms of structure. That's not actually what I was talking about. And that's not what most people are talking about when they talk about systems and structures. Again, that's a very tight correlation to draw, but if we would accept that correlation, then sure. But it's not only that we're not accepting it, it's actually not what we're talking about. And postmodern, I'm sorry? You know, so did your kid get all that? Did you get all that? Did James Lindsay get all that? This is not light reading, folks. This is highly sophisticated and intellectually rigorous. It's the kind of thing you study with a dictionary at the ready. Saying that children are learning critical race theory in our schools is like saying kids are learning quantum physics because it's something that is being taught in college, primarily in law school, and involves critical thinking and debate, where students are encouraged to examine the ideas involved and ask whether or not they hold up to scrutiny. Something critics of critical race theory and proponents of debate shouldn't like. So as I said, short answer to, is this being taught in our public schools? No. The longer answer to this question is longer, but before we get to that longer answer, we should take a moment to examine where this moral panic came from in the first place. How is it that a decades-old obscure academic term suddenly does this in the Google search results? It really all starts with a man named Christopher Rufo, not to be confused with Obviously, this critical race theory boogeyman wasn't started by the fictional Peter Pan foil Rufio from a book. That would be silly. Christopher Rufo is a right-wing reactionary activist, failed politician, and self-proclaimed investigative reporter who rapidly found himself rise to prominence as a countervailing force to the nationwide protests that took place in response to the public lynching of George Floyd and so many others in the summer of 2020 by sensationalizing, misleading, and outright lying about what was happening in diversity training programs across the country. He described the diversity training program conducted in the city of Seattle as cult programming and claimed that critical race theory has become, in essence, American people. To prove his point, he asserted that the Treasury Department had hired a diversity consultant who told Treasury employees essentially that America was a fundamentally white supremacist country, and I quote, virtually all white people uphold the system of racism and white superiority. Now, it turns out these claims were not entirely accurate. I mean, it sounds like something I might say, and probably will say before the end of this episode, but according to the 33-page document that Rufo provided to support his claims, it's clear that, at best, he was recklessly distorting the nature of the program, but more likely, he was outright lying about it. So, of course, he quickly found himself on Tucker Carlson's show. You know, Tucker, this is something I've been investigating for the last 6 months, and it's absolutely astonishing how critical race theory has pervaded every institution in the federal government. And what I've discovered is that critical race theory has become, in essence, the default ideology of the federal bureaucracy and is now being weaponized against the American people.
The morning after his appearance, Rufo was called by Donald Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, who told Rufo that the president saw your segment on Tucker last night, and he's instructed me to take action. According to the Washington Post, the reaction to Rufo's appearance that evening on Fox News was swift. The next day, Trump demanded action. 2 days later, his budget chief issued a memo laying the groundwork for the federal government to cancel all diversity trainings. An executive order followed, and Rufo was invited to the White House a few months later for a meeting. Now, the funny thing is that even though Rufo set in motion a rage-filled delirium over critical race theory that would eventually entirely envelop our political discourse and advise hundreds of leaders throughout the country on the issue, Rufo had only recently learned of the term himself by reviewing the footnotes of popular anti-racism books by Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi. Far from being an investigative reporter, the truth is that Rufo is a right-wing reactionary activist with an explicit agenda, and Rufo himself has not shied away from stating this agenda explicitly. We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. So, Major League Baseball moves the All-Star game because of racist voting laws in Georgia? Critical race theory. Juneteenth becomes a federal holiday? Critical race theory. Vanessa Williams sings the Black National Anthem on Independence Day? Critical race theory. Your roommate walks in on you while masturbating? Hot. What was I talking about? Critical race theory has essentially become a stand-in for any discussion of racial inequality or the history of racism in America, which is why it is not at all surprising that Rufo's claims about critical race theory are either entirely misrepresentative or outright lies. In his explicit effort to drive up negative perceptions of critical race theory, Rufo created a CRT briefing book. And if we spent the necessary time it would take to adequately debunk every aspect of this sacred tome of garbage, this episode would last an entire semester, and you might have to take on student loans to do so, which would disproportionately impact you if you happen to be black. Critical race theory! So I'm not going to do that, but it's worth taking a look at a particularly egregious claim that he makes about critical race theory to give you a sense of the kind of nonsense Rufo's peddling. In a section of his CRT briefing book called Race Essentialism, Rufo claims that critical race theory reduces individuals to the quasi-metaphysical categories of blackness and whiteness, then loads those categories with value connotations. Positive traits are attributed to blackness and negative traits are attributed to whiteness. This claim is literally the exact opposite of what critical race theory pretends. Race essentialism is a belief in a genetic or biological essence that defines all members of a racial category. In fact, as I previously noted, critical race theorists explicitly argue that the concept of race is not a biological reality, but in fact, a social construct. And even more than that, a legal construct. That is to say that the very existence of race as a concept in America was actually created in part by our legal system. And frankly, hard to argue with that assertion, considering the fact that in the infamous Dred Scott decision regarding runaway slaves, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, an asshole, stated that African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. There may not be any inherent biological differences between the races beyond the characteristics of skin color in reality, but the system of laws and their enforcement in our nation created a very real legal difference between white people and black people that carries a very real and material legacy to this day. The very fact this country had laws against interracial marriage until 1967 is an example of this legal construction of race. And that legal construction helped create and reinforce the social construction of race in America, which is the only reason we are even talking about any of this at all right now. Also, wokeness! And this little detour into our history of the long-standing impact of our racist laws gives us some insight into what this trip is all about. And considering the fact that Rufo is making Kendi one of the primary villains in this manufactured hysteria about critical race theory, I think it's only fair and balanced to ask Kendi himself what he thinks this is all about.
I think what's being
described as critical race theory is any analysis, critical analysis of race or racism in this country that does not position this country as culture. Any attempt to hold people who are being racist accountable, any attempt to have a clear and complex, multivariate approach to American history, whereby we actually document and talk about and teach about the history of racism in this country.
Now, I think Kenny might be onto something, because it's pretty clear that the focus of the anti-critical race theory phenomenon has been largely centered around the teaching of our history, specifically with regards to the history of racism in America. And speaking of history, it's worth reiterating that all of this anti-critical race theory mania is unambiguously a backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement that coalesced into the largest sustained protest movement in American history over the summer of 2020, animated by the fact that the entire nation watched in horror as a white police officer pressed his knee onto George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds amidst a crowd of people begging the officer to spare Floyd's life. With his hands casually placed in his pockets, it was clear that this police officer believed that George Floyd had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And one of the most significant aspects to this movement that was different from other Black liberation movements of the past was that this movement included a whole lot of white people, including a lot of white people who grew up in the era of colorblindness and were learning about the devastating impact of racism in our society for the first time in their lives. And so, in addition to the increased awareness of systemic racism that took place as a result of this movement throughout our society, it's not that surprising that this moment has also included some misguided excesses and cynical efforts of appropriation, clumsy conversations about race in school board meetings, efforts by corporations or the military to adopt anti-racist language or make symbolic gestures in hopes of deflecting from the structural critiques of racism and capitalism that implicate them, and some cringy virtue signaling by people that may have taken the writings of Robin DiAngelo a bit too far. Side note, it's pretty funny that one of the things that set this off is a book called White Fragility, which led a bunch of white people to flip out and try to ban any discussion of race. For all the book's flaws, maybe, at the very least, the title was onto something. And so part of the enormous backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement, as Rufo explicitly stated, was to put all of the various cultural insanities under the brand category of critical race theory. It didn't matter that Robin DiAngelo was not a critical race theorist, or that her emphasis on the racist beliefs held by individuals was actually at odds with critical race theory's focus on more systemic and legal critiques, or that her participation in diversity training programs for corporations restricted her from leveling an honest assessment of capitalism's role in systemic racism. The fact is that this reactionary backlash was not interested in a conversation about actual critical race theory. The goal was to label any effort to examine the impact of racism in our society as critical race theory, and make sure that when people heard that term, they had a negative association with it. To put it more simply, by cutting out the middleman, they wanted people to have a negative association with any examination of racism in our society, and particularly throughout our history. Which is why one of this reactionary effort's main targets has been the 1619 Project, which I can't wait to talk to you about. But while we wait out this storm, here's an ad. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Still don't. I'm Internet's TV's guy from Some More News. You might know me from Some More News, a show you are literally watching right now. Now, everyone's always asking me, Cody, how are you always so calm and collected when talking about the news? Well, this Cody keeps his cool by enjoying the relaxing sounds of raccoons screaming, which I listen to on a cassette tape recorder hooked up to a Bluetooth transmitter and then received through my Raycon earbuds. Oh, how I do enjoy my comfortable Raycon earbuds. They're like buds for your ears. We actually teamed up with the folks at Raycon, and if you click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/somenews, you can get 15% off your Raycon purchase. Take a look at these puppies. Wait, I read that wrong. Take a look at these puppies. Whether I'm at home washing dishes or out at the mall washing dishes, I can always listen to those sweet, sweet raccoons thanks to Raycon earbuds having a 32-hour battery life. Not to mention their gel chips designed for maximum comfort. These don't stick out of your ears like some other brands, and also not like some other brands, Raycon earbuds cost half the price. They also have a 45-day happiness guarantee. So whether it be raccoons scurrying or raccoons sleeping or just raccoons eating, Raycon will be there to help you listen to all kinds of raccoons with ease and comfort. They're comfy, more affordable than other premium audio brands, long-lasting, and come with a 45-day guarantee. And again, you can get 15% off your next purchase by clicking that link in the description box or going to buyraycon.com/somenews. Happy raccoons to all. This has been a message by Guy from Some More News, enjoyer of rainy raccoon sounds and Raycon earbuds. Storm's clear now. What were we talking about? Ah, yes, the 1619 Project. Is an ongoing initiative in the New York Times Magazine that began in August 2019, the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery. It aims to reframe the country's history of placing the consequences of slavery and the contribution of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. Considering the fact that the central role and lasting impact of slavery has typically been minimized in the way our history has been taught in this country. I mean, this is why we had so many statues that had to be torn down in the first place. Maybe this effort is a good thing. But of course, conservatives reacted to this undertaking by acting like the creator of this project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, just cut off Uncle Sam's dick and fed it to communists in front of children. Newt Gingrich called it brainwashing. He introduced a bill to ban it from being taught in public schools, retorting that, as the founding fathers thought, slavery was the necessary evil upon which the Union was built. And very smart best friends of mine like Ben Shabibs called it pseudo-history, because some historians argue that one of the essays exaggerated a claim about the role the preservation of slavery played in independence. Two, one of the primary reasons that some of the colonists decided to declare their independence. Because, you know, a lot of them did. The states, they wrote it down. Conservatives use this arguably slightly exaggerated claim to try and discredit the entire endeavor as revisionist history. Yet, for some reason, they seem to have no problem with this exchange.
You said our children are taught in school to hate our country. Where did you see that? I just look at school, I watch, I read. Look at the stuff. Now they want to change it. 1492, Columbus discovered America. You know, we grew up, you grew up, we all did that. So now they want to make it the 1619 Project. Where did that come from? What does it represent? I don't even know. So it's like, that's what they're saying, but they don't even know.
Look at the stuff. As this clip proves, conservatives honestly believe that the teaching of history should not include any political agenda or propaganda and should be taught accurately and truthfully. And so in direct response to the 1619 Project, the Trump administration launched a commission to create the 1776 Report, an effort undertaken by an 18-member panel that included famed historian Charlie Kirk. In fact, as The Guardian reported at the time, most of the authors listed at the commission lacked credentials as historians, and scholars noted the report was missing citations, bibliographies, and scholarly references. By the way, have you read this thing? You've got to read this thing. It's not that long, and it's truly pathetic. Get this, the 1776 report removed any mention of slavery from its section of our nation's founding, and instead relegated the topic to its own subsection under a broader category called Challenges to American Principles. A section which also happened to include fascism and communism, as if slavery were some sort of foreign threat and not an American institution practiced by many of our founding fathers, and was a reason a lot of states changed countries. And in this short section on slavery, the report makes all sorts of excuses for it, like everyone was doing it, which is a weird argument to make when you're trying to claim that America is a uniquely exceptional nation. Also, that's what children say. Other excuses included, but George Washington
free his slaves, even though, in fact, he made private efforts to prevent his slaves from claiming their freedom. It also argues that the compromise of slavery was necessary for a durable union, despite the fact quick study of American history shows that these compromises were, in fact, far from durable. So, a real quick history lesson for you. America had a pretty bad, like a civil war, I guess would be the term. It was kind of a big deal at the time. About 1 in every 10 men in this country died from this war. And I don't want to say anything too controversial here. Please don't cancel. But the Civil War was caused by the issue of slavery. Specifically, people liking war was a somewhat important thing that happened in terms of our national narrative or whatever. Yet, the 1776 project hardly mentions it. The only times it's brought up at all is as a lead-in to how progressivism created a shadow government intent on taking away your rights, and how identity politics is the same as the beliefs of racist slaveholder John C. Calhoun. Incidentally, progressivism, and a category that conflates racism and identity politics called racism and identity politics, are also listed as challenges to American principles alongside slavery, fascism, and communism. Progressivism, fascism, and slavery. Yep, yeah. But despite these partisan opinions and obvious activist propaganda, the 1776 report also argues that states and school districts should reject any curriculum that promotes one-sided partisan opinions, activist propaganda, or factional ideologies that demean America's heritage, dishonor our heroes, or deny our principles. Anytime teachers or administrators promote political agendas in the classroom, they abuse their platform and dishonor every family and trust them with their children's education and moral development. These conservatives are so concerned about propaganda, so concerned that the report also argues that educators must convey a sense of enlightened patriotism that equips each generation with the knowledge of America's founding principles, a deep reverence for their liberties, and a profound love of their country. Totally normal freedom stuff. Hey, remember that viral story about the girl from North Korea that went to college in America and was like, wow, wokeness is worse than living in North Korea? One of the things she cites is that in North Korea, they hate America. And in America, they also hate America. And I feel like there's maybe a disconnect there about how we're free to do that and allegedly aren't fed nationalist propaganda about how we're a perfect nation and all others are bad and inferior. Something to consider. But why is lying about our history considered more patriotic than owning up to our mistakes? Don't ask me to love the fact that America enslaved black people for nearly 200 years. Don't ask me to love the fact that America committed genocide against the native inhabitants of this land. Don't ask me to be an enabler of America's addiction to committing atrocities. Yes, I love what America could be, a borderless beacon of hope that enriched the world of nationalism by evolving beyond the need for nations. But maybe America needs some tough love. Maybe America needs an intervention. Project from his website and disbanded the effort. This has not stopped local and state governments from following through on the 1776 report's stated goals with regard to education. In a matter of months, Republican lawmakers in nearly half of the states have proposed legislation to limit the teaching of concepts such as racial equity and white privilege. Florida has banned the teaching of the theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. Senator Josh Hawley has introduced the Love of America Act to combat critical race theory and teach kids to love America because he believes it is a lie to teach students that America is systematically racist. A teacher in Tennessee was fired or canceled, if you will, for teaching an essay about white privilege written by Ta-Nehisi Coates. A new law in Texas removes the requirement to teach the history of white supremacy, including slavery, the Ku Klux Klan, and ways in which the white supremacist hate was morally wrong. The law also makes other changes that would drop the teaching of some of the most prominent civil rights leaders in our history, which actually is something worth loving. Among the figures whose works would be dropped, Susan B. Anthony, Cesar Chavez, and Martin Luther King Jr., whose I Have a Dream speech changed, and letter from a Birmingham jail would no longer make the curriculum cut. And in a way, if you truly do oppose critical race theory, cutting out Martin Luther King Jr. makes a lot of sense. Because despite the claims of historian Donald John President that critical race theory is a Marxist doctrine that rejects the vision of Martin Luther King Jr., a line that he definitely wrote and definitely understands, in reality, the work of Martin Luther King was actually one of the major influences for the development of critical race theory in the first place. And just a quick reminder, won't keep you long, MLK was a radical leftist who opposed U.S. imperialism, criticized capitalism, called for a federal jobs guarantee, and made the case for reparations. It's no wonder the FBI saw him as a communist threat and even spied on him and blackmailed him and urged him to commit suicide. In fact, recently released FBI documents reveal that the FBI believed that King is a wholehearted Marxist who has studied Marxism, believes it, and agrees with it. And while this may or may not be true, why should it matter? I still contend that the most frightening thing about Karl Marx was actually his hair, which I gotta say, it's out of control, man. But more importantly, this red-baited today movements for racial equality seem really super scary. As American as saying something as American as apple pie, a dessert invented in England. Here's a photo taken in a protest against school integration in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1959 of a little white boy holding a sign that reads, "Race mixing is communism." And here's the modern day version of Senator Joseph McCarthy, Senator Raphael Edward Cruz on his podcast in 2021. Yes, his senator has a podcast, talking with none other than Christopher Rufo, using the exact same Red Scare playbook.
All of this originated in Marxism. What's interesting is it didn't just originate in Marxism. The end point that this curriculum is designed to teach the kids to go to is Marxism itself. It is designed to tear down capitalism and replace it with communism, replace it with Marxism, and with government power, although on racial lines. And is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think it is. In fact, critical race theory, as these people present it, is just the newest iteration of the anti-Semitic trope of cultural Marxism, but with a little more mainstream appeal, because anti-blackness has a bit more oomph in the context of America. And maybe this history should be taught in our schools. Maybe the problem is not that we are teaching too much about the history of slavery and racism, but that we haven't been teaching this history enough. The Southern Poverty Law Center did a study on 12 popular U.S. history books, surveyed more than 1,700 social studies teachers and 1,000 high school seniors to try and determine how much history schools are teaching about race and slavery. Their percent of high school seniors can identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. 2/3 didn't know that it took a constitutional amendment to end slavery, and only 22% were able to identify how provisions in the Constitution gave advantages to slave owners. And I just can't stress this enough. 8% were able to identify that slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War, which I guess isn't surprising, considering that Texas only just decided to teach that fact in 2018. Because it turns out that different states are allowed to teach about slavery as much or as little as they want. And usually it's the latter. While Massachusetts mentions slavery 104 times in its social studies framework, Louisiana only mentions it 4 times, as in 4 times total for K through 12th grade, which is still twice as much as they mentioned it in Idaho. This might be why 85% of teachers said that their textbooks were inadequate in teaching Black history, also known as history. This is backed up by the fact that out of all the books the Southern Poverty Law Center went over, not a single textbook addressed how white supremacy factored into justification of slavery, or how depressingly essential slavery was to the American economy. And this is just the one study. If you look for it, you can find a wide and dizzying array of schools routinely fucking up the way they teach about slavery in America. This 4th grade class asks students to name 3 good things about slavery. Then there's a school in upstate New York that just this year, the year 2021, in homework for elementary school kids,
historians describe slavery as African Americans agreeing to work for colonists in exchange for a trip to America. Literally just not teaching slavery as slavery. So that's totally normal. Hey, speaking of things that were totally normal, did you know that there were nearly 8 million KKK members in the 1920s, or that Georgetown University was funded by the selling of 272 slaves? Hey, did you know that Bank of America, Setember, Wells Fargo, and JP Morgan all accepted slaves as deposits? Have you ever considered or been taught in school about just how many American companies and institutions think that perhaps be a good thing to know? Also, geez, I'm not sure if you know this because you may have gone to an American school, but Black history isn't entirely just the slavery and civil rights eras. Like, obviously, those are important to teach. But as a few have pointed out, most schools pretty much stop there and call it a day. And in fact, the United States History Content Standards for grades 5 to 12 only require schools to teach the baseline subject of slavery and civil rights, and then nothing else about Black history or culture. You know, stuff like the Reconstruction era, which most schools don't teach. Nor do they teach about the Great Migration, or how about the fact that over 60% of Americans know nothing about Juneteenth, which is probably why the Tulsa Race Massacre and countless other massacres has been strangely absent from history textbooks for decades, even in Tulsa, an event where a white mob attacked and killed hundreds of Black residents, injured even more, and razed over 35 city blocks, was just completely absent from our history until a HBO show about fictional superheroes brought it up. How damn weird and sad is that? And this is just Black history I'm talking about, and not like Native American history, but heck, I'm sure the way schools teach that is very thorough. Boy, howdy, it sure seems like most Americans don't know shit about our history with racism and slavery. I don't know, perhaps if we did teach these things, we would have fewer people going on TV saying nonsense like this.
The miracle was not founded on racism. Now, don't get me wrong, yeah, there was slavery going on, but slavery itself was not initially a racist thing. It never was about race initially. So to sit there and take it like America was founded on racism is a complete lie. Yeah, there was slavery going on, but slavery was going on in all the world. It never was a race thing, so why are we making it a race thing now?
Now, I'm hoping that I don't need to defend the idea that slavery in America was very much a race thing. Yes, the institution of slavery existed in the world before the transatlantic slave trade. There were indentured servants from Europe for a time in America, but it's also true that slavery in the New World was a uniquely brutal institution, and that after uprisings like Bacon's Rebellion, we saw European and African servants join forces against the ruling elite, lawmakers began to make legal distinctions between white and Black inhabitants. By permanently enslaving Virginia, the